deepwater disaster cost billions. Most people imagine the Deepwater Horizon as a drilling rig that simply blew up without warning, a catastrophic mechanical failure that came out of nowhere. That's the wrong picture. What actually unfolded came down to a single valve, a 5-story column of steel sitting on the ocean floor known as a blowout preventer. This was the last line of defense, an apparatus engineered for one specific purpose: to seal a well in an emergency by cutting clean through a steel pipe. One job, on the night of April 20th, 2010, it couldn't do it. What followed from that one failure is a story worth understanding in full. The well went by the name Macondo. It sat roughly 5,000 feet beneath the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, about 40 miles from the Louisiana coastline. BP held ownership of the well. Transocean owned and ran the rig doing the drilling, a floating platform the industry knew as the Deepwater Horizon. Halliburton had recently completed a cement job deep inside the wellbore, a barrier designed to prevent oil and gas from migrating up the pipe before crews permanently capped the well. That barrier had already failed. Nobody aboard the rig had any idea. Then came the procedure specifically designed to catch that exact kind of failure. It was called a negative pressure test, a standard check meant to confirm the well was properly sealed before operations moved to the next stage. The crew ran it. The readings came back strange, inconsistent. The kind of numbers that should have set off alarms. The crew talked it through, settled on an interpretation that made sense to them, and pressed ahead. They had it wrong. Gas had already begun its migration up the well column. Shortly before 9:45 that evening, mud erupted onto the rig floor, followed immediately by gas. Within minutes, ignition. 11 crew members died in the explosion. 17 more were injured. The rig burned for 36 straight hours before slipping beneath the surface on April 22nd, dragging the riser pipe down with it and leaving a wellhead gushing raw crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico from nearly a mile underwater, a depth no one could easily reach. Here's where the blowout preventer was supposed to be the hero of the story. Bolted to the wellhead on the ocean floor, this device housed enormous hydraulic rams, essentially industrial guillotines, engineered to snap shut with brutal force and slice clean through the drill pipe the moment disaster struck, sealing the well off entirely. When the crew understood what was unfolding beneath them, they activated it. Nothing happened. The exact reason has been argued over in courtrooms for the better part of a decade, but the most widely accepted explanation is almost painfully straightforward. During the chaos of the blowout, the drill pipe had buckled and drifted a few inches off-center inside the wellbore, and the shear rams, designed to cut through pipe sitting perfectly centered, couldn't get a clean grip on pipe that had wandered out of position. A piece of equipment engineered for precisely this kind of catastrophe was defeated by a matter of inches. And just like that, oil began pouring freely into the Gulf of Mexico, completely unchecked, from a puncture in the seafloor nearly a mile beneath the surface. It would take 87 days to stop it. 87 days of crude bleeding into the Gulf before engineers finally sealed the well permanently on July 15th. Over that stretch of time, an estimated 4.9 million barrels of oil escaped into the water, more than 200 million gallons, cementing its place as the largest marine oil spill in American history, and it wasn't even close. Before we get to the financial wreckage, take a moment with that figure. 200 million gallons is enough to fill over 300 Olympic swimming pools, not released in a single catastrophic burst, but in a relentless underwater torrent for nearly 3 consecutive months, carried by ocean currents, bleeding across more than 43,000 square miles of open water and coastline spanning 5 states. Let's start building the bill with the costs that couldn't wait, the ones BP had to absorb before anyone had a chance to draw up a budget. In the months before the relief wells were operational, BP threw everything it had at the blowout. A containment dome they called the top hat was lowered over the well, only to be rendered useless when ice crystals formed and blocked it. Top kill followed. Engineers pumped heavy drilling mud straight into the blowout preventer, trying to overwhelm the pressure and drive the oil back down into the earth. It didn't work. Then came the junk shot, a last resort improvisation that sent golf balls and chunks of rubber down into the wellbore, hoping to plug it by sheer obstruction. That failed too. Every one of these attempts burned through real dollars and returned nothing except more crude pouring into the Gulf of Mexico. What ultimately solved the problem was a solution that couldn't be rushed. 2 relief wells, drilled from separate rigs, angled down through more than 3 miles of rock to intercept the damaged wellbore from below, where heavy mud and cement could finally seal it shut. That alone took months. And it was just one piece of a response that, at full mobilization, put more than 47,000 people, nearly 7,000 vessels, and dozens of aircraft to work simultaneously. Now, let's talk about the final invoice. Because even measured against the worst corporate catastrophes in modern history, the number is hard to absorb. After years of settlements, court judgments, government fines, and cleanup bills, BP set aside more than $65 billion to cover the consequences of Deepwater Horizon. To put that figure in terms that might actually land, it exceeds what Disney spent to purchase all of 21st Century Fox in 2019, the movies, the television studios, the entire empire, in one of the biggest media deals ever struck. That $65 billion didn't arrive as a single demand. It accumulated over years, one bill stacked on top of another. Cleanup operations alone ran BP roughly $15 billion. The fleets of skimmer boats, the controlled burns on the surface, more than 4 million feet of containment booms stretched across the water, and the legions of workers in protective gear combing through oiled beaches by hand in the punishing Gulf summer. Then came the legal consequences. In 2012, BP entered guilty pleas on 14 felony criminal counts and agreed to a $4 billion criminal settlement, the largest criminal resolution in the history of the United States at that point, a sum large enough to purchase close to 10,000 average American homes outright. Then the civil penalties arrived. The Clean Water Act holds companies financially responsible for oil spills through a per-barrel fine structure, and that rate increases roughly fourfold when a court determines the company acted with gross negligence rather than ordinary negligence. In 2014, a federal judge concluded that BP had indeed crossed that line into gross negligence, pointing to choices the company had made in the days before the blowout that sacrificed well safety in favor of saving time and cutting costs. That single ruling dramatically increased BP's exposure under the Clean Water Act compared to what it would have faced otherwise. By 2015, BP had agreed to pay $5.5 billion in Clean Water Act fines alone, folded into a broader settlement with the federal government and 5 Gulf states that reached $20.8 billion in total, the largest settlement ever reached between the United States government and a single company. Within that $20.8 billion figure, as much as $8.8 billion was set aside specifically for the restoration of natural resources, wetlands, fisheries, and wildlife habitats that the spill had damaged. That money was still flowing into restoration projects along the Gulf Coast more than a decade later. Beyond the government settlements, BP paid out roughly another $20 billion to private claimants, individual residents, commercial fishermen, hotel owners, restaurant operators, and Gulf Coast businesses whose survival had depended on clean water and accessible beaches during that summer. More than 400,000 individual claims moved through the settlement process, some resolved quickly, others disputed for years, with BP still receiving new claim determinations and cutting checks as late as 2018, a full 8 years after the well blew out. Here's the section that almost never makes the headlines, because everyone's fixated on the fines. The stock market rendered its own judgment within days. BP's share price cratered by more than 50% over the roughly 2 months after the explosion, tumbling from around $59 a share in April to approximately $27 by late June. At the bottom of that freefall, BP had hemorrhaged somewhere close to $100 billion in shareholder value, roughly the equivalent of erasing the entire market capitalization of a company the size of Nike across just a few weeks. For a brief stretch that summer, BP was even circulating through rumor mills as a potential acquisition target for a rival oil major, a company suddenly seen as vulnerable simply because investors had lost that much faith in its ability to weather what was coming. BP suspended its dividend altogether for the rest of 2010, the first time that had happened since the Second World War, just to hold on to enough cash to cover a bill nobody could yet put a firm number on. Transocean, the company that owned and operated the rig, didn't walk away clean either. Transocean pleaded guilty to violating the Clean Water Act and absorbed $400 million in criminal fines, layered on top of a separate $1 billion civil settlement with the federal government. Halliburton, whose cement work at the base of the well had broken down to begin with, agreed to pay $1.1 billion to settle claims tied to its part in the disaster, while entering a guilty plea on a single misdemeanor charge for destroying evidence connected to internal tests it had conducted on the cement mixture. 3 separate companies, 3 distinct roles inside the same chain of failures, 3 individual settlements, all of it tracing back to one blowout preventer that failed to seal properly around one drill pipe that wasn't sitting in quite the right position. Here's what actually demands your attention, because this is where the line between an accident and what Deepwater Horizon truly was gets drawn. The federal investigation, together with BP's own internal review, uncovered a lengthy chain of decisions that each saved time or money in isolation and each raised the risk level in the same breath. The cement formulation chosen at the base of the well was later deemed inadequate for that well's particular conditions. The negative pressure test, which returned ambiguous readings, was read in the most convenient light rather than the most careful one. Red flags in the hours leading up to the blowout, strange pressure fluctuations, mud returns that didn't add up, were rationalized away instead of being pursued. And the blowout preventer itself, the piece of equipment designed to be the absolute last line of defense against precisely this kind of failure, carried a design flaw. Its shear rams couldn't reliably cut through a pipe that had buckled off-center, a scenario neither regulators nor manufacturers had properly accounted for. None of that points to a single villain at the center of the story. What it points to is this: the death toll from Deepwater Horizon wasn't nature catching everyone off guard. It was the cost of a long sequence of choices, each one defensible when looked at on its own, that together stripped away every layer of protection standing between an operational oil well and catastrophe. So, what did the world receive in exchange for a price tag of that magnitude? Deepwater Horizon fundamentally rewrote the rules governing offshore drilling in the United States. The agency that had been simultaneously overseeing offshore drilling safety and managing leasing operations, long criticized for the obvious conflict of interest between championing drilling and policing it, was split into distinct bodies with distinct responsibilities. Blowout preventer standards were overhauled, with new requirements for redundant shear rams and improved centering mechanisms aimed specifically at the failure mode that brought down the Macondo well. A 6-month moratorium was imposed on deep water drilling throughout the Gulf of Mexico while safety reviews were conducted, costing the offshore drilling industry billions in halted operations and stalled projects. An expensive pause, but arguably an unavoidable one, given how much regulators still hadn't reckoned with about the risks they'd been permitting all along. There's a piece of this catastrophe that resists clean accounting, and it's the part that matters most. A fine has a number attached to it. A settlement comes with a check. But environmental devastation and long-term health consequences don't show up on a single invoice. They compound quietly across years, sometimes decades, before anyone fully understands what was lost. The human death toll is not in question. 11 men died on that rig the night everything went wrong. What followed is harder to price. More than 1,300 miles of shoreline across 5 states took on oil in varying degrees. Scientists documented lasting damage to deep-sea coral ecosystems, to dolphin populations concentrated in the worst-hit zones, and to commercially fished species, shrimp, crab, finfish, spread across the northern Gulf. More than 10 years on, researchers are still publishing studies trying to understand the full shape of that damage. The Natural Resource Damage Assessment, the same process that eventually produced the $8.8 billion restoration commitment, required years to complete. That wasn't bureaucratic slowness. It was the genuine difficulty of translating generations of ecological harm into a number that could survive legal scrutiny. Many of the scientists who participated in that process have said plainly that no settlement, regardless of size, could ever fully account for what disappeared. And then there's a stranger cost hiding inside all of this, one that almost never surfaces in the headline figures. BP launched a program called Vessels of Opportunity. The pitch was simple. Local shrimpers, crabbers, and charter boat captains, most of whom had just watched their entire summer season evaporate when fishing closures went into effect, could be paid to deploy their own boats in the cleanup. They laid containment boom. They skimmed oil. They worked the same waters they could no longer fish. What it amounted to, in practice, was BP renting back the coastline it had just ruined and paying the people it already owed compensation to for the privilege of cleaning up the mess. Some of those boats absorbed contamination during the work and required their own damage claims afterward. At its peak, the program involved thousands of vessels. It became one of the largest civilian mobilizations ever assembled for an industrial cleanup. a strange, improvised economy that materialized almost overnight along a stretch of coast that, until a few weeks before, had run on seafood and tourism. Then there's the question of the chemical dispersant BP deployed to break apart the oil before it could wash ashore in thick, suffocating sheets, a substance called Corexit, used in volumes surpassing 1.8 million gallons. That included an unprecedented large-scale application pumped directly at the wellhead, nearly a mile beneath the ocean surface, rather than being limited to surface treatment alone. The Environmental Protection Agency signed off on its continued use even after flagging concerns about its toxicity, largely because the alternative, uncontained oil sweeping across thousands of additional miles of coastline, was deemed the greater of two evils. Long-term health studies tracking cleanup workers who were exposed to both crude oil and dispersant chemicals are still being released to this day. Several have identified elevated rates of respiratory illness and skin conditions among the men and women who spent that summer out on the water, a cost that never appears anywhere in BP's balance sheet, but shows up instead in medical claims and long-running health monitoring programs that, not unlike Chernobyl's liquidators on the other side of the world, no one ever fully accounted for before the fact. Now let's add it up the way BP's own accountants were eventually forced to. $15 billion in direct cleanup costs, $20 billion in private economic damage payments, $20.8 billion in the landmark federal and state settlement covering the Clean Water Act penalty and natural resource restoration funding, $4 billion in criminal fines, billions more in legal fees, administrative overhead, and smaller settlements scattered throughout. The total lands somewhere above $65 billion. And that's before you factor in the roughly $100 billion in shareholder value that simply vanished in the weeks following the explosion. That evaporated wealth represents real losses absorbed by pension funds, retirement accounts, and ordinary investors who happened to own BP stock and had absolutely nothing to do with what unfolded on that rig. Here's the raw arithmetic that sits beneath everything else. BP is still an operational, profitable enterprise today. It liquidated tens of billions of dollars worth of assets, oil fields and refineries spread across several continents to help finance the settlements, which left the company considerably smaller than it had been. It endured, primarily because oil majors of BP's scale generate massive ongoing cash flows, and because the payments were distributed across nearly 2 decades rather than being called in all at once. A smaller company carrying an identical tab would never have made it through. Deepwater Horizon didn't destroy BP. It permanently rebuilt BP around a single inescapable truth. What one failed valve, sitting a mile beneath the surface, ultimately came to cost. Run the counterfactual for a second because it sharpens just how razor-thin the margin was that night. If the negative pressure test had been interpreted correctly, if the crew had recognized that the anomalous readings meant the well was unsealed rather than convincing themselves of an explanation that let them push ahead, the blowout preventer almost certainly would have never entered the picture at all, and Macondo would have been added to the long list of wells capped on time, on budget, without producing a single news story. The price of halting the disaster at that point would have amounted to a postponed afternoon and a second cement job. A rounding error against $65 billion. Instead, a test that took less than an hour to conduct and read became the pivot on which the entire catastrophe turned, much the same way 36 seconds transformed a routine turbine test into the most expensive industrial accident in history, half a world away and a quarter century before. Line them up next to each other and let the contrast do the talking. On one side, a single blowout preventer, a device engineered for the sole purpose of stopping this exact kind of disaster, unable to seal a pipe that had drifted just a few inches out of alignment. On the other side, somewhere around $65 billion in direct costs, another $100 billion gone from shareholder value, 11 families who went to bed that night with someone and woke up without them, and a stretch of American coastline that scientists are still picking apart for damage more than a decade on. Deepwater Horizon wasn't the inevitable result of pushing drilling into water that deep. It was the result of something far more unsettling. A string of decisions, each one modest enough on its own. A cement job, a pressure test that nobody read correctly, a machine that simply could not cut through a pipe sitting a few inches from where it was supposed to be. None of those things standing alone brings down a rig. But they didn't stand alone. They stacked up in exactly the wrong sequence on exactly the wrong night, and the disaster that followed wasn't written into the geology or the physics. It was written into the choices, The world has been settling that debt ever since, one legal agreement at a time, spread out across the better part of 15 years and counting.